I can't remember how many years ago it was now, that I saw this picture in a magazine of what I thought was a piece of wax paper in a shell, and I went, that is the most exquisite still life painting I have ever seen. Dutch Golden Age be damned. And I found out it was this woman, Sadie Valeri. And she tells me she went to RISD. I went to RISD for a little while. She actually graduated from RISD, I didn't. And she has some interesting things to say about her education there compared to the education, or as she probably would refer to it, the real education she got by working with contemporary masters. So that's one of the things she'll be talking about as she speaks with us today. So without any further ado, Sadie, we're so delighted to have you here. Thank you very much for coming.
So I'm so happy to be able to do this. It's been just such an amazing opportunity to be invited to do to create a painting for an idea I was already starting to think about before I was invited to this show, and was really a natural extension of some of my ideas. And to be invited to talk about the things that I'm most excited about, I couldn't think of an organization and a museum that dovetails so well with all the ideas that I'm super excited about. So I'm so happy to talk to you guys today. So as she said, I went to RISD, and I graduated back in '93, and it looks like several of you are my age or older, and then a few of you are my age or younger. Those of you who are my age or older will probably have a feeling of resonance when I describe the 70s and 80s and 90s in our education as sort of a dark age. And I'll go much more into that when I actually start my talk. But the contrast between what is available today, you all found out about today, maybe through a postcard, but much more likely through an online connection, through some way of receiving the information. I find it continually amazing that the way that this resurgence of realism is happening is because we're all connected by the most advanced technology that human beings have ever made for communication. So I find that just amazing. You can find your teachers, and you can find your students can find you, and that has made our education realist. Our education, I believe, truly available to women for literally the first time in history. The last time that it was standard for all artists who wanted to be realistic painters to work from the nude model, not just be like a quick foundation studies and a degree program. The last time that this was really made part of your standard education, the way it has become, was right about the time that it stopped being valued. So as we heard earlier, they let women into the École des Beaux-Arts in 1897. How soon after that did we see that realistic training and realism went out of fashion? 10 years, 20 years, maybe 30? I have a tiny little theory. If I was going to go back and get a degree and write a dissertation, my dissertation would be on, was it the association of women getting realist training for the first time in history that turned the tide away from realism? As we tend to associate women with a certain art form, ceramics, crafts, anything related to fibers, anything related to pottery, the value of that art goes down. Is it possible that just the fact that they finally opened the doors to the women that have been banging on them since before the French Revolution, is it possible that the association of letting all these ladies into the art schools compounded with a little bit of all the other factors, the Industrial Revolution, the invention of the handheld consumer affordable camera, and the World Wars and everything that changed everything about art? Was that one factor? So that's a whole nother talk. That's just a little idea. When I was 14 years old, maybe 15, I was really, really lucky to have to go to school with a very, very strict French headmistress. And the French believe that you are not an educated person if you don't know who Michelangelo is, and if you don't know a basic understanding of art history. So I had a wonderful introduction to art history at 14, 15, 16 years old by this headmistress of this very small school. I graduated with 13 people in my graduating class. And it was very academically rigorous, but they believed, and a lot of Europeans still believe this, that a good education includes theater, chorus. My sister's here, we went to the same school. We both had to sing in the chorus. We both had to act in plays. We both had to paint and draw. In my class of 13 graduating students, I was not the only artist. I think a lot of us in high school or in middle school were maybe the one artist out of 100 students. There were 3 out of the 13 that we were the class artists, because this education was standard. You didn't just, it wasn't an elective to take art, you had to take art. So this really fundamentally Renaissance idea that to be an educated, well-rounded person, you not only had to study history and science and math, but you had to study art and have a basic conversant ability to talk about art and draw a little bit. I mean, people who did not consider themselves artists were sitting there drawing all 4 years. So it was a really unique education. So I was lucky to have access to an art library, and I picked up this book of Michelangelo drawings when I was about 14 or 15 years old, and I was just filled with one thought, and that was, I want to be able to draw like that. That became my vision, that became my standard. Even though I learned a lot more about art history and was introduced to a lot more artists, there's kind of your artists that are your first loves, right? You just go back to as your touchstone over and over. And for me, it's Michelangelo, and seeing these drawings really made a huge difference to me, seeing it in the reproduction. Does anybody, we're in a room full of artists. I probably could just put up the names now, but does anybody know the names of these? You can just shout it out if you know any. Van Gogh, Monet. I actually gave a similar talk with this slide to a tech audience, because a year ago I made a commitment. Anytime anybody asked me to speak in public, I was going to say yes, because I actually enjoy it a lot. I did this to a group of tech artists, tech designers, young entrepreneurs in San Francisco. They wanted to have an artistic talk, so I did a little 15-minute talk for them. And that whole room could name those as well. I mean, they're just really part of our culture. Now in this room, I expect many of you, if not most of you, can name these 2 artists. Can you just shout out the names of Solomon J. Solomon? Anybody guess that one? And Bouguereau. Yeah, is Bouguereau or Bouguereau? En français, c'est Bouguereau, je crois. I don't know. Bouguereau or Bouguereau? I don't know. My French headmistress would be horrified. In 1989, though, she didn't introduce me to Bouguereau. Nobody talked about Bouguereau in 88, 89, right? So even my French headmistress was like, oh, he's on the, if you go to the Musée d'Orsay, there's the right side of the tracks, and then all the good stuff is on the left side of the tracks. He was over on the right side of the tracks. The Musée d'Orsay used to be more formally organized against the salon stuff and then displaying the genius of the people who rebelled against the salon. So even my very well-educated, well-rounded headmistress definitely had a bias against Bouguereau as well. So these 2 artists, I went to 4 years of art school. I focused all of my art history classes on fin du siècle, late 19th century painting. I never heard of either of these artists. I graduated in 1993, never heard of either of these artists. Maybe somebody showed me that painting on the right, certainly didn't make me write his name down, and was like, oh, this is what we don't do, right? The poo-poo of that. So I was taught, oh, it's saccharine, it's fake, it's all these bad things about this. Honestly, there's problems with how modern eyes see this painting, right? This is not a progressive painting, right? And so that's part of one of the reasons that we've really turned away from it, is that this art really was about a very, very narrow view of women. And comparing it to some of the artists that we saw in the slide lecture earlier today, Effie had lovely, amazing paintings of women in action, not languid. So that's a legitimate reason to rebel against the salon. I have a feeling, though, it wasn't early feminists who changed the course of art history. I have a feeling they're affected by it. But. So this painting by Solomon J. Solomon, this artist grew up in London, and in London, he would have seen Van Dyck painting. Van Dyck painting was his old master. The Van Dyck painting is, 250 years earlier. I can't do math, but you can check my math. You can see that Solomon J. Solomon is looking at Van Dyck because that was the way art education happened. We also heard some great thoughts earlier today of, if you're a male artist in art school and looking at the history of art education and looking back at paintings, well, here's a guy looking at a guy, right? We have a lot of guys looking at guys. So that's a whole nother thing to go into, but that was really the basis of art education, is that you knew your art history and your viewers knew your art history. When this was exhibited in the salon, even the general population would know that this painting, know the story that this painting was referencing, and would also know the painting that this painting was referencing. Solomon J. Solomon, the younger artist here, is trying to be better than Van Dyck. He's not saying I can be just as good as Van Dyck. He's saying I can be better than Van Dyck. So that's a lot of confidence, right? That's pretty much the definition of confidence. What's that? I know, and if he had done a not very good job, we might have shunned him for it more, but he did a pretty amazing job. This is the typical non-genius art student of the late 19th century. If you went to art school in the late 19th century, or from 1650 to 1910, you were considered adept if you could do this. You were considered talented, but not a genius among your peers. This was a normal drawing to be able to do of a figure after completing cast drawing, working from plaster casts of ancient sculptures, and moving into working from the live model. This is an advanced, this is somebody who's probably just starting to paint. There's a little bit of a feeling of narrative. You almost feel like he's receiving a revelation or mourning somebody. So this is a painter starting to think about, how can I think about the life model in a way that would work in a painting? How can I use the sterility of the model room to make a narrative? I can look up the name of this artist. It's nobody any of us have ever heard of, and not because he's written out of the history books, just because he was a standard artist of the time. He wasn't considered some amazing genius. If I had done that at RISD, I would have been considered an amazing genius. You can see that he's looking at Michelangelo too. You can feel this connection with 500 years of history. And who's Michelangelo looking at? Does anybody know what this is called or where this is? You can just shout. What's that? It's the Belvedere torso. It's in the Vatican Museum. I took this picture. See how there's no tourists in there? I found the greatest trick I'm going to tell all of you. I was told by somebody who lived in Rome. Go the last time slot of the day, get off the beaten path, because everybody's shuffled through in the same order, and try to see everything backwards. The guards whistle when they're trying to herd you out of the museum. They go, and from far away you can hear them whistling acres away as they're herding everybody out. And I could hear them whistling. I was in the room with this all with my husband and just me for a good 15 minutes. It was a really life-changing experience for me to be in the room with a piece of sculpture that I have studied and that many of the artists that I have studied have found inspiration here. Michelangelo was actually asked by the Pope to restore this, and he refused, saying that his abilities would never match the ability of the original sculptor. The original sculptor made this in about year 200. They recently figured out, I think within the last 10 years, they figured out it's a copy of another sculpture that was 100 years older. So everybody's looking at everybody, right? This was dug out of the ground about 75 years before Michelangelo would have seen it, but in fairly recent history, and put on display as part of the dawn of the Renaissance, when they started saying, well, you know, that rock with that really nice serratus, we should probably dig it up, right? We could probably learn something from it. So does anybody know what this is by the style of the drawing, or have you studied this drawing? You know. Do you know? It's Bargue, not Braque, not Bargue. B-A-R-G-U-E is a plate, a book of plates that were designed in the late 19th century that are drawings of casts of ancient sculptures to teach beginning drawing students how to draw. And there were different sets of these plates that were used to teach young artists how to draw. This set became the standard for French art schools, and therefore the world. And it was commissioned by Jerome was hired to make these plates, because Jerome, who we have a painting of in the other room, was asked by the state to make these set of standard plates as a teaching tool for everybody. He had a student named Bargue, which is a very hard word, B-A-R-G-U-E, not Q-U-E, but the U-E on the end makes you think it's bark. B-A-R-G-U-E, who was his student, but obviously was a very good student, could draw extremely well. His student was actually a 35-year-old trained lithographer when he started studying painting with Jerome, and in that era, he was about 10 years too late. But he's very, very good at drawing because he'd already been a lithographer. So this is a drawing in the mid-19th century of a 1st century BC sculpture. Probably done as a cast, because you can see the lighting is very controlled, and usually in a gallery space, the lighting is not controlled enough to be able to do it. So probably lit as a cast. Plaster cast. Does anybody know this artist? Give people, if you know, just automatically, don't say it, but give people a second to think about it. This is probably, if not the most famous 20th century artist, one of the most famous 20th century artists, his student work. Not Dali? Picasso. Isn't that amazing? These are his student works. Look, he did the Belvedere torso down there. He probably did these when he was about 14, 15 years old, and when he was a very young student, and you just wouldn't guess. I mean, if you didn't know, I didn't know. I was told. You just wouldn't guess. So even our most forward-thinking artist, Picasso, many people believe is one of the most pivotal artists of the 20th century, was still coming from a place where he knew art history, he understood the tradition he was working in, and he gleaned as much as he possibly could. And it was so standard for him to work this way that at 14, 15-year-old, oh, you want to be an artist? Sure, you're going to start with this. This is where you start. And then he did this. Only a few decades in between. Okay, somebody here, you just said you went to RISD. I didn't know that. You went to RISD?
But I graduated in 1979.
1979. I think I had the same education as you, and I think they're offering the same thing now. If you Google RISD, Rhode Island School of Design is shortened to RISD, RISD. If you Google RISD figure drawing, this is what comes up. And this looks exactly, I was surprised when I did it. I did this a couple years ago. I was surprised that these drawings look exactly like the drawings that I was doing when I was at RISD. This is really coming out of the mid-century New York City abstract expressionists, a little bit of figuration work. This is not coming from an academic tradition, because a few hours away at Yale, they were literally rolling Michelangelo casts down the stairs. The iconoclasm was complete. There was no studying from history. You can kind of see the guy in the lower left. That's sort of an academic pose. That's sort of a traditional pose. This is what an art school student is doing now versus what an art school student was doing in the late 1800s. When I was in high school, I thought the late 1800s was ancient history. It seems so long ago, right? We're talking about our grandmother's grandmothers. It's not that long ago. In fact, many of us have grandparents who got a little bit of training in Philadelphia, maybe they took some classes in Paris, who did beautiful drawings of their grandchildren. Somebody pulled out something that their grandparents had done. They live in a house in California for a few decades, and they're cleaning out the attic. And I looked at it, and I was like, this is amazing. And they said, oh, she lived in Philadelphia in her youth. Well, these beautiful drawings of these people who are now grandparents now when they were children were by somebody who was classically trained, who was trained in this tradition. It's not that long ago. It's really not that the standard of the ability to draw wasn't considered to be this thunderbolt, this strike of genius, one among billions, but just that everybody should learn how to draw. Right? So that's what you get when you Google RISD figure drawing, because this is what RISD figure drawing is aiming for you to do, right? So I have had phases in my artistic development when each of these people were my biggest hero of the year. I do not shun these people. These are amazing, amazing artists. It's just I've gone in a little bit different direction. But these were the heroes of my art school, especially Basquiat, because he was only a little bit older than us, and he made it. The way to make it as an artist was to be discovered, right? Be given a free art studio to paint and draw in for a year, paid for by the gallery, which is what happened to Basquiat, and then have a huge show in New York City and get sold out and become a millionaire. And that was all of our dream. There was no other path. I know that other people were getting a different education. At Rhode Island School of Design, not everybody was getting that education, but at RISD, we were not told about the palette and chisel. We were not told about Richard Schmid. We were not told about the lineage of American Impressionism that was still alive. That was all very shunned. You went to RISD too. That was all very shunned. And so there were things happening, but unless we weren't even encouraged to read art magazines because they were seaside schlock or something. I don't know. The culture was against this. To be a real artist, you had to be not only doing something like this, but doing something so new none of these artists had seen it yet, by the time you're about 20. So I just keep coming back to Michelangelo. I'm in art school, and I was like, okay, I just finished my sophomore year. Is it junior year we learn to draw like Michelangelo? Is it senior year we learn to draw like Michelangelo? What year does that start? And so I'm wondering, this is a drawing that I did a year after I graduated from art school. I was good at art school. I got very good grades. I got invited to the invitational shows for the junior year and the senior year. I felt like a successful artist. I felt very talented. I felt very rewarded. I felt very successful. And like a lot of artists in art school, I felt like I was going to graduate and be like, okay, world, I can draw. What do you want me to do? Now pay me. And the career messages I got were sort of like, well, art's hard. Yeah, I know. Okay, that's fine. I can do hard. There wasn't, there never is a career path. So I don't know what they were supposed to tell us. But my clearest idea of how you became an artist was to be Basquiat. Right? Like live in a loft in New York City that's already way too expensive, that Wall Street bankers are already taking over, and hope someone sees what I'm doing. That was the plan, right? So I was actually living in Boston. I joined a figure drawing group. I remember, this is when I did this drawing, somebody else from the figure drawing group came up to me and said, oh, you went to RISD, they teach anatomy there, right? I had taken anatomy at Brown with a biology professor at Brown. They really weren't teaching anatomy at RISD. So I did this drawing in 1994 when I was 23 years old. Age 35, 12 years later, as a graphic designer in the meantime, I was still doing drop-in figure drawing groups. Did this in 2006 at age 35. You can see that I'm trying to be both Michelangelo, but like new and expressive, right? You can see the young art student. I have compassion for this art student, trying as hard as I can to get as much information as I can, but also be original, right? At 2007, I had the amazing luck to decide I wanted to take an art class, because once you go to RISD, then you're supposed to get your master's, which I didn't do. You're not supposed to take art classes. Who takes art classes? I have a degree from RISD. Why would I take an art class? I had started painting and drawing a little bit on my own, broke through a very deep, dark, cold artist block. I hadn't painted for 10 years. I decided that I wasn't an artist. I decided I wasn't a real artist. I stopped from about 23 to 33 completely. And I am still really angry. I feel like I lost a crucial decade of development. I went to a week-long workshop, and the week-long workshop was with Julia Aristides. And Julia Aristides is one of the very few top master figure drawing teachers teaching in a traditional academic tradition. And the first day I was like, what are we doing? And the second day I was like, this is weird. We're gonna spend the whole week on one pose? I'd only ever done a 40-minute drawing. We're gonna do a 40-hour drawing? At the end of the week, my mind was blown. I said, I just learned more in 5 days than I learned in 4 years of full-time art school and everything since. A couple years, I kept practicing. I kept doing workshops. A couple years later, not too long later, I did this drawing on the right in a non-instructed model session that I was hosting in my own studio. And this is a couple years of classical, mostly, not on painting, mostly focused on figure drawing. 2 years of studying with Ted Seth Jacobs, Michael Grimaldi, Julia Aristides, Dan Thompson. Anybody that I could identify was really doing the kind of drawing that I recognize as being in the tradition. I've been searching for this since I was 14. Where had this been? I knew what I was looking for. I suddenly felt like, I went to Paris. I did a semester abroad in Paris, thinking, well, it's not here. I did it senior year. Do you know how damaging that is to your social life to go away for most of your senior year? I did it senior year instead of junior year because I was getting desperate. When did they start teaching us how to draw like Michelangelo? Well, maybe they're doing it in Paris. And I went to Parsons School of Design, but even if I had gone to a French school in Paris, they weren't teaching that. Not then, I don't know if they are now. So I just wasn't finding it. So about the second or third day I was working with Julia Aristides, I literally felt like a ladder had fallen down from the place I'd been trying to reach since I was 14. And I was 34. I was born in 1971. I was 35, 36. I was born in 1971. Guess what year Juliet was born in? 1971. I looked at her and I was like, you are 15 years ahead of me, and I'm gonna catch up. I just suddenly saw what I had been looking for so long, and I suddenly started realizing this is my path. This is my path to what I've always wanted to do. This is a drawing I did about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. There is a method. There are steps. There are things that you can teach. And they have been purposely not taught to us. Many of us were lucky. We stumbled across an amazing artist that we hung onto their ankle and gleaned as much information as we could from. Some of them were in the art school. There were great teachers in art schools that had gleaned the knowledge that they had, and they were passing it along. A lot of people have been doing a lot of good work through the dark ages of our education, but nothing has happened the way it is now that we can all see. And this might not be your cup of tea. You might not want to draw the same style, the same method, but you can find who you're interested in. You can finally find it. I wasn't consciously thinking about Belvedere torso when I did this drawing. I just liked the aesthetic, but I did put the slideshow together. I was like, oh, looks like I'm really trying hard there. So we have this whole lineage going from the 19th century back to Michelangelo, back to the 1st century. This is just what survives, right? These are all works done by my students. This information is learnable and trainable. I blogged the entire thing. You can see everything from my less than adept little still life experiments. Starting in 2006, I blogged almost every single day for about 4 or 5 years. I blogged the entire process. You can still probably, you can find it. If you can't find it, email me, I'll send it to you, but I don't go look. People started asking me if I would teach because I was describing everything I was learning. I was recording every single day, which I think is the best way to learn, whether you do it in your own journals or whether you do it publicly on. I had been in the world of web design, so I was comfortable with making a blog. And so I was just blogging everything from my mom, who's sitting right there, you know, and my immediate family to see what I was doing. And then I started getting more and more followers, and people started saying, do you teach? And I was like, what do you mean? I just learned this last year. I'm just like so ready for it. So I started accepting, I got a little studio and I started accepting students, private students into my studio to teach figure drawing. Eventually I built up a cast collection, started teaching cast drawing. The school has grown and grown and grown. There is such a thirst for knowledge. People who didn't know that they couldn't get it, people younger than me who are like, oh, if you want to study art, you look on the internet for art teachers. That's just normal to them. And then people my age and older who are like, oh, where has this been? Someone's actually going to tell me the steps to make a drawing, and I'm going to see myself get better. Not in 6 weeks, but I'm going to see myself get better in 6 months and 2 years, and I'm going to have the knowledge that I need to get better every single year for the rest of my life. You can get a vision. That exists now. The school is now, it's not just classical training, it's a range of artists teaching all sorts of different contemporary and classical realistic art training. We have about 6 teachers. One of my teachers is here today, Diana Corvell, who does beautiful work. We have about 6 teachers. We have about 150 students a week, and we are in a 3,000 square foot space, and we just keep growing and growing and growing. The thirst and the desire, it's a human innate desire to want to draw pictures and want to paint pictures. There's something that drives us over and over and over to keep looking. I did this painting as one of my first few paintings doing crumpled wax paper. What I did is I had a tiny little shed I converted to my art studio. I could touch both walls with my fingertips. And I couldn't hire a model. I didn't have enough room, so I set up still lifes. And I decided, well, I want to set up the most complicated still lifes I can find, and drapery is really complicated, organic, non-man-made forms. And I felt like, well, I can apply my figure drawing practice to drapery studies. So I started crumpling up wax paper and making little compositions because it wouldn't move and it wouldn't decay. It wasn't fruit, it wasn't plants, it just wouldn't decay, and I could spend 100 hours on a painting if I wanted to. And I was like, nobody's gonna, this is just a weird subject, nobody's gonna really get it, but I just wanna do it. And for my own personal development, it was really the first time in my life where I was like, nobody's gonna get this, I've never seen anybody do this, it's kind of a weird subject, but I like it, so I'm just gonna do it. And for whatever reason, I did not have that self-confidence when I was 22, 23 years old. I didn't have that self-confidence until I was about 34, 35, to take what I learned and then just go with my own ideas. My mom really liked this one. My mom likes everything I do. But people started liking them, and they started showing them, and I started selling them. This I had done just 2 years before. Was that 2006? Does this back up too?
Yes, push the top button.
The top one. There we go. 2009, 2006. That was that same era. I'm not studying painting at this time. I'm studying figure drawing. Long pose, 40-hour figure drawing. That's what's getting me to slow down and be able to really see and absorb what I'm seeing. This is a great exercise, by the way. Set up 2 white objects. Just do not put that much reflected light in that egg. Oh my God, it kills me. I tell my students every single day, don't do that. And then I was looking back through my old slides like, oh God. These are 2 of the most recent paintings I've recently done, taking this wax paper idea to as far as I can go. I've started suspending the wax paper crumpling it up. I wrap it around other objects to get the sort of spiral shapes that I want. On the one on the left, everything's suspended by strings from a curtain that I have hung, a dark curtain that's hung in my studio. I work only from life. That's one of the reasons that I don't paint a lot of perishable objects unless I'm doing single session Alla Prima studies of them. If I'm going to do a long-term indirect painting, I usually do non-perishable objects, and the wax paper makes just a really nice way to make it a compelling, interesting conversation. I love the aspect of reflection and transparency that you get. It's got these really, really nice, beautiful highlights, but it's also very transparent in areas. I really spend quite a long time sculpting it before I start painting it to arrange the composition. So on a day that I'm setting up a still life, I usually spend a couple days setting it up. I'll be wading through a foot-deep sea of discarded wax paper by the time I've done. And I get more picky the more I do it. So those are a couple. Now, this painting that I did in the museum was a real departure, not a departure, but a pretty significant evolution. 1:55, how do I have to? Okay, good, we're doing good on time. What was it, about a year ago, I can't quite remember, when they contacted me about this show. They said, choose a painting from the collection. And I knew that they had Bouguereaus, and actually my first thought was, I'm not gonna pick the Bouguereau. It's just so classical and so what I do, and I mean, I don't do Bouguereaus, but it's so in the tradition of what I do, and it's sort of predictable, and then I looked and looked and looked, and I was like, I just want to do the Bouguereau. So what's amazing about this painting, this Bouguereau painting, you can see it right through there. It's kind of amazing to do a slideshow and have the original in my line of sight. You guys can't see it maybe. This painting encapsulates so much for me in terms of it's great that we can see it in person. There's nobody alive who is handling gradations of value and color temperature the way that he is handling it. The technical expertise is absolutely stunning. And as an artist, you can see it from across the room and be like, oh yeah, those Bouguereau ladies. You get up close to it and you're just like, how did he do that? I mean, it just makes you cry. But then there's also really big problems with this painting. This painting was not bought by the French. The French did not like Bouguereau at this point. The Americans were buying Bouguereaus at this point. American men were buying Bouguereaus at this point. Bouguereau was really making his living making a French idea of a painting. So naked ladies in France sound great to American businessmen. So there's problems. You know, how many French nudes, hairless French nudes, can I pile into a painting? You know, I mean, there's just so many things wrong with it. I mean, there's many reasons that we are told don't look at Bouguereau for the last several decades. There's many good reasons for that. But as a painter, as an artist, if you look at how he handles the shift of the light from compared to the top of the thigh to the way the shadow looks from the knee down, the values are so close, and it's just a color temperature shift that makes that shadow. And you just look at it and you go, really? We're going to throw all this away? We're just going to ignore the training here? So somehow, I don't really get it. I need time to write a dissertation to figure it out. Somehow, contemporary art has made this huge stance for feminism. But it's not like they're letting us in the galleries, so I don't know what the deal is. You know, there's some sort of way that it's passé and wrong and bad for so many reasons to like French academic art in the contemporary art world. But at the same time, it's not actually a really progressive community, so I don't really know how that's working. These are several of my students. These students did that work that you saw on the slide. We came to the museum. When we took this picture, I was still saying, well, I'm not doing the Bouguereau, but let's all stand in front of the Bouguereau. So this drawing over here on the left, I'm going to take you, I think probably many of you have seen a blog post that I did that was shared with Artists on Art of all the steps of how I made the painting. So I'm going to kind of fly through this. You can read through more of the detailed steps. But I brought a few of these sketches in because I thought it might be nice and fun to see them in person, see some of the sketches that I did. So the drawing on the left, the left, I actually did before they even invited me to participate in this show. I just had this idea of some way of moving in a figurative direction with the wax paper idea. But I didn't really want to make a woman look like she was wrapped or dressed or sort of partially dressed. You know, my plan is not to put women in lingerie. That's not my intention. But somehow have the figure kind of emerge abstractly from the idea of the wax paper. So I had done, is that me whistling? Is that my feedback or something? So I had done this quick little sketch. This sketch is actually from another Bouguereau painting, but he actually uses the same model in this one. But just a real quick little pencil sketch, and I just had it hung up, propped up on my shelf for a while. So when they asked me to do this, I was like, well, I've already had this idea of somehow trying to use the wax paper in a more figurative direction, combining different things, combining figure drawing, combining art history, combining the way I use wax paper to make my compositions, and try and do something a little bit different and larger. I really was wanting to work larger. So this really kind of dovetailed, but I had to kind of take some steps to get there. So I first started just doing these sketches. These Alla Prima single session painting sketches, maybe 2 days on a couple of them, just to sort of hang up the wax paper and just look at the abstract elements and just start to get some ideas flowing, because I really didn't know how I was going to do this. Then I made this painting, which is actually, I brought in, colors are always so different in person. I brought this one in, and this is a very literal description of the wax paper that I hung up. I sculpted the wax paper how I wanted it. I didn't try to turn the wax paper into anything else. I just wanted to explore the idea of how realistic can I get it, but with a little bit looser method and style. And then I actually have this one. Oh, here it is. Then I did this one incorporating one of the Bouguereau figures in a looser way. And I didn't do any underdrawing for this one, and I really felt like I was paying the price for it. I was having to figure out that figure over and over and over again. So that kind of made me realize, well, if I'm going to do this big, I can't be figuring out the figures halfway through, so I need to do a real detailed study first. So I started doing these little sketches on Mylar, which is it's a nice way to work. If you haven't worked on Mylar, it's nice to do a sketch on it because it makes you not worried about using up a $20 Raymar panel or something. It makes you kind of loosen up a little bit. And I did this one first, just a basic value study. And I did this one where I just kind of blurred everything a little bit. And then I did several that were sort of like these two, of just seeing how much can I make the image look more like the wax paper or more like something else and less like the figures, and where is that balance between losing the figures completely and not being able to see them at all versus more literally having them in there. And I decided that I liked this composition, so I went with that one. And then this was sort of the hardest part, is doing a very detailed line drawing of what had been a pretty loose sketch. And I really wanted to get the Bouguereau's figures in very precisely to reference that painting. So I don't measure. So my grids are never grids because I'm likely to do the math wrong. So I just do grids with diagonal lines, and the diagonal lines tell you where to do your cross sections. So I have sort of this lattice work way of doing grids. And once I had my drawing done, I transferred it to the panel. This is actually not the drawing for the painting. This is a drawing for one of the smaller studies just to practice the process. But you can see I used umber paint and flipped it over to transfer the drawing. Before I'd ever done this before, I thought it would just make a mess. Like the umber paint would go all over the panel. But it really works quite well. It really just traces just the line that you press over when you transfer the drawing. And the nice thing about that is that your underdrawing is made of the same paint that you're then going to use on top. So you're not fighting between two different media. And then I set everything up, and I set up my studio so that all my sketches were in view, so I could kind of reference everything as I worked. You can see I have a whole tangle of wax paper pinned up on my curtain there. And my mother taught me how to thread a needle, and I still use that skill to this day. And started doing an underpainting, and started developing the drawing. And because I had done all these sketches and all this work, I don't know about you guys, but nothing sucks the life out of a painting more than racing to finish it in time to let it dry and varnish it and ship it to a show. And the best part of the painting is the last 6% that you're working on it, right? Like the real fun part, like you've done all the structure, you've made all your major decisions, and you finally get to noodle, which is what we want to do in the beginning anyway, right? So you finally get to noodle and you get to do all the fun stuff, and then you're like, oh gosh, it's got to dry for at least 2 weeks before I varnish it. You know, when you're really cramming a deadline. So I just didn't want to go through this on this painting, and so I had set this schedule. I'm not naturally organized. I'm actually very disorganized, as my immediately family will tell you, but most people tell me all the time how organized I am because I've worked really hard against it. But I had a whole schedule set up of do this month for sketches, this month for some more detailed studies, this couple weeks to really work out the drawing extremely well, and then a couple weeks to finish the painting. But a nice slow pace, because as soon as you're rushing, it all falls apart, right? I see so many heads nodding. That's the most head nodding I've we all relate to that. And you can see my palette down there. I've got a red-green palette. I started playing around with that for my monochromes, and I'll do a little quick demonstration of that as well. So I'm mixing red and green, which are complementary colors, to make a dead gray neutral. It's kind of I'm amazed every time. I'll show it to you. I'm amazed every time it happens. Like, how do you go from this green to this red, and they go dead solid neutral gray in the middle when you mix them together, and then using white to make a grayscale out of those. So some layer, you can see the top part has more development of paint, the bottom part is still the underpainting. Now the whole surface is covered, but there's not a lot of detail on there. So there's about 3 layers of paint at that point. This is probably 4 and 5 and 6 layers. I don't know if you've also noticed this, but if you do work that has many, many layers, in the early stages, every day you take a picture, it looks so different. And the last stage is like, okay, well, there's another huge amount of work in there, but the 2 pictures don't look very different. So that's either the final or very close. It's not signed, so it's not totally final, but it's very close to the final. And that's the final painting, which you guys have all seen upstairs. So I kind of went all the way, that's like my whole life. 14 to, 47. And I'm going to do a little bit of demo of some drawing and some painting for you, but does anybody have any comments or questions for anything? I don't have time to make a painting or make a drawing. Like I said, I'm pretty slow. So I'm going to demonstrate a couple different concepts to you. I'm going to do, I think I'm going to stand awkwardly to the side. And some of you in the back might actually want to stand up and come a little closer if you want. So I just think the red-green thing is really fun. Who's worked like this? Has anybody mixed the red and green and seen what they do or work like that often? Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. So I always smear my white like this. Oh, I should have some paper towels. They are there. So I always smear my white down the side like that, and I think it's a really cool trick. I'm just going to tell you about it right now, just super quickly, because how many times have you taken your brush around to the back side of your nugget of paint a few hours into the painting day to try and find the clean white paint on the back? So if you make a nice long smear of it, all day long you can dip into this and have a nice clear patch. So I have all my students do that. And then sometimes I do it with my black. This is actually a dark brown. As well. That's actually a raw umber today. I put raw umber on there today. Sometimes I do like that. With a little teeny tiny travel palette like this, you don't have much room. So you're kind of sacrificing some of your space, but I like being able to access clean color all the time. So This is quinacridone red by Williamsburg, and it is powerful. So a little goes a long way. I really like the quinacridone reds. I started moving away from alizarin because it can be fugitive, which means that it could fade over time, so your reds can disappear. So I love alizarin. Don't we all have a love affair with alizarin? Alizarin is just like the best tube ever. I've weaned myself off of it. I like this quinacridone red. It's not as translucent as alizarin, but the way that it mixes as a cool red with other paints is excellent. I've tried almost every cool red of 10 brands, and the Williamsburg quinacridone red I feel like is the most versatile. You can get a great orange and you can get a great purple. And that's sort of the definition of a primary color, that you can, on both sides of the primary color, get really, really good mixtures. This one is a new one. I've just started working with this Chromium green Oxide. It's also by Williamsburg, and I love it. It's a really neat color because even though it's very opaque, actually. It's not a jewel tone at all. It's very opaque. But it surprisingly mixes into darks very well. It doesn't make them go ashy. I'm going to try and do big patches. So even though it's a very opaque color, sometimes an opaque color would make the blacks go sort of bluish ashy. And I don't know about you, but like avoiding the bluish or purple ash color is the number one thing I try and do when I paint. I feel like every painting just wants to be washed out, ashy, blue, purple. So I'm always trying to avoid those to get a rich value range. So I really like this Chromium green Oxide. And so if I take some of this, I've never mixed from this direction before. This is fascinating. I would need one of those cooking shows where they have like a camera here and it's displayed up on the screen, but I didn't really. So I'm just taking a little bit of red, but like I took a very small amount of red and it's still too much. I'm going to mix it here, and I'm going to mix a little white in so you can see what's happening. The lights in here are yellow as well, which makes it a little hard to see, even for me this close. And you want to ask yourself over and over and over, does it look green or does it look red? And if you can name one, add the other one. So to me, this still looks a tiny bit green, so I'm going to add a little tiny more red. And I'm going to add red until it doesn't look green anymore. And they're complementary colors, meaning they're opposite on the color wheel, so they cancel each other out. And now I'm going to add a little bit of white for this so that you can see it, and I'll make a nice big spread of it so you might be able to see it. Let's do that. You see that? So all that is green and red and white, and you get that dead, neutral, straight gray. It might actually be going a little bit red, but because of these lights, I don't know. I might actually put a little more green in, but I just wanted you guys to see that. So when I've made a chromatic gray, a gray made out of chromas like this, when I add color to it, I can get more chroma in the color. Because a dead neutral gray that right out of the tube, or a gray made out of black plus white, if you add any color to it, it really drains the color out. Gray will just desaturate any other color. Whereas if I add a little bit of color to this, I can make it shift it a little more blue or a little more yellow, and the chroma still stays. So chroma is just the intensity of the color. So we have value, high value is light, low value is dark. We have hue, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, or purple, which is like a hula hoop around the middle. And then we have saturated or desaturated. So saturated is out on the edges, desaturated is right towards that middle core of black, gray, and white, which is zero color, so zero chroma. I use chroma and saturation interchangeably. It's not scientifically accurate, but I use all the words that I can for low chroma because it's a really key concept for teaching color theory. So this is almost zero chroma, dead gray, coming from two very high chroma colors. And that's because they're across each other on the color wheel. And if you mix two things that are directly across, they meet in the middle, and the dead center middle is neutral. Color theory is always imperfect. You kind of have to find one that kind of makes sense to you and go with it, I think. Because it also interacts with light color theory, the way you're perceiving the color, and then the variables get very scientific and complicated. So you have to find what works for you. But I found this really works for me. And then I'll make a value scale. So I'll make lighter and lighter versions of it. This is as dark as it will get, because if I add more green, it'll turn green, and if I add more red, it'll turn red. So I can't get that any darker, but what I can do is I can add a little raw umber to it, and I can make a darker version of it. So I can make, and it stays fairly neutral. You could also add black, and black is one of the not using black is probably the only rule that I've retained from RISD. I had a great color theory teacher, and I just don't feel the need for it. I don't have a rule against it for my students necessarily. I just find that it can tend to contaminate your whole entire palette and get mixed into things accidentally and lower chroma, and I'm always fighting to get chroma back. Even though I do very neutral paintings, it kills me to take a photo of them because they look black and white, but they're all made with color. So I'm sure you all have the same experience. You take a picture, and especially these phones, they amplify the magentas and the yellows to give everybody a healthy Kodak glow, right? But then they make your paintings turn like orange and magenta. Yep. Does anybody have any questions or comments about that?
So far you haven't edited any medium.
I haven't, although it's a little too stiff to paint with. Okay. Right now what I'm using for medium is just linseed oil. I would say the main thing that I think is most important to know about mediums is not to use varnish in your medium. So you can mix lots of different things, but don't put varnish in your medium if you plan to varnish your painting. Because varnish is made to be removed, and so if you go to clean or remove, or you damage the varnish, or a collector damages the varnish and you need to remove it, if you remove the varnish, if you've used varnish in your layers, it can take up paint pretty easily. So there's these traditional mixtures. Hi, so nice to see you. There are these traditional mixtures that include varnish. I've been taught by a lot of painters to use varnish, but especially because I paint in so many layers, my more detailed paintings will have 10, 15 layers. I don't want to take off the top 5 if I need to change the varnish. And you can make a great medium without using any varnish at all. So that's my spiel about varnish. I get like militant about certain things. I'm a scary teacher. I sound nice now, but when I don't know. I find that if something works, go with it. If something doesn't work, don't do it. Like, don't keep following a rule just to follow an arbitrary rule. If black works for you, use it. But also know what you're getting into. Know exactly what's in your medium. I've taken the materials workshop. How many of you took that materials workshop? I've hosted it twice at my studio. It's an amazing workshop. It's so much math. I take like the highlights and I follow the highlights, but it's so much math and science that I kind of just have to do what makes sense to me. And so I know I'm pretty safe with linseed. So I use linseed and sometimes I mix stand oil, which is just thickened linseed. And that way I just know what's in my paint. And if I'm using brands that have real simple ingredients lists, it's just like not eating processed food. If you just know what you're eating or know what's in your paint, you're more likely to not have disasters. Okay, what's the time?
2:26.
Oh, I'm actually like a little bit ahead of schedule. What I really want to show you is a quick demonstration of straight line block-in and how I personally teach straight line block-in because the nature, does anybody know what straight line block-in is? No. All right, I will talk about what that is. So straight line block-in for me was a revelation in terms of a method for drawing. And this is really based on a 19th century method for drawing. And instead of copying curves that you see, you simplify everything into straight lines. So maybe you already knew what it was. I just call it straight line blocking. It's a classical way of teaching. And the reason is that it's much easier for us to judge the tilt of a line than it is for us to judge how something undulates. And the reason is that as human beings, our eyes tend to be attracted to anything that draws attention. So if there's a gentle curve but it has a bump on it, we will stare at that bump. And anytime we stare at something, we enlarge it. So that's why exaggerations tend to happen in our drawings. Anything that we're interested in, anything that consciously or unconsciously draws our attention, we tend to enlarge it. Because if we are either shooting an animal with a bow and arrow or picking berries out of the bush, in both of those cases, we really need to be ignoring all the extraneous information and enlarging the one piece of information that's really important. And so for survival reasons, our brains are really, really good at doing that, right? They're really, really good at doing that. Sam's been taking classes. She took classes with me years ago. I'm saying the same things I probably said to her a very long time ago. So it's really, our brains are really, really good at it. And whether you're picking something up off a table, or whether you're looking at somebody in the face and trying to decide if they're going to be your friend or not, or if you relate to them or not, your brain is doing all sorts of things where it's changing the size of everything you look at. You're sort of zooming in on important parts. That's why we always draw figures with very large heads, because the head is very important to us. It's also the reason that every child draws a figure as a head with 2 long lines, because we're all legs with a very important head on the top to a small child, right? And so, and then they're like, oh, now I need arms. So then they stick arms out of the sides of the legs, and then they go, oh, I need fingers, and they add fingers. It's actually a verbal way of seeing. It's actually, when a child does that, they're practicing the verbal part of their brain. Every child goes through very distinct universal stages of drawing a human figure, starting with a circle with 2 dots and expanding to there. But it's really not drawing. We call it drawing, but it's more symbol drawing. It's more related to verbal brain. And so things that are important, just like in pre-Renaissance painting, things that are important, like God, are big, and things that are less important, like the patrons or the sheep, are small. And in the Renaissance is when we started saying, well, we want our paintings to look like when we see a manger with sheep, and the sheep don't look too small. Right, and the baby looks, well, they did babies weird for a long time, but that's all thing. So wanting to actually draw and paint in the way that you see and allow the viewer to focus their eyes on the head and the eyes of your subject. You don't have to make the head and the eyes of your subject large. So straight line blocking helps you ignore that bump for the meantime while you're trying to get the big proportions. And one way that because of the nature of my studio, even though I'm an atelier and I teach classical drawing and painting, unlike a lot of ateliers, because it's San Francisco and it's expensive and everybody is sort of camping out while they're studying, living with a relative, or working several different hourly wage jobs, it's very, very hard to attend school 5 days a week. So most of my students are part-time, 1, 2, or 3 days a week. And so because of that, I have a lot of students. It used to be that I used to teach every single student personally. And so I got up to about 46, and then I had to start getting assistants to help me because there's only so many times I can say things. But what it did was it helped me develop ways of teaching drawing that were designed in such a way that somebody coming 1 day a week, as long as they were practicing between, please do your homework, somebody's coming to the studio 1 day a week, that they can start to pick up some of these drawing ideas in a very efficient way, and I can help them diagnose when they are going off course. And so what I developed is this way of doing it in steps. So I'm going to show you a 2-step, we also do a 3-step and a 4-step. And I call this the 4-step block-in method, because what we do is we do the same drawing over and over, and each drawing we develop to a further degree. And that way, if you draw for 25 minutes and I get around to your easel, I can say, oh, look back there in step 2. It's always step 2. All right, so when you're doing a figure drawing and you finish the whole drawing and you're like, oh, I made the pelvis too low and the legs are too short and the head is too big, it's one thing if you spent 40 minutes on the drawing. It's another thing if you spent 12, 20, or 50 hours on the drawing. You don't want to do a 12-hour drawing and then find out that you didn't put the pelvis high enough and the legs are too short. Who's ever put the pelvis too low and made the legs too short? Everybody in figure drawing has always done that. So you want to be identifying the big stuff early. So I have set up a little teeny tiny cast and a little teeny tiny shadow box to sort of emulate this. And so what we always, I'm going to do a 1-step and a 2-step drawing. I can do a 4-step. It'll be too small. No, what I have some smaller, simpler casts. We don't usually start out with the Venus de Milo. We start out with birds. Little white plaster casts of bird sculptures, and we'll do 4 on a page. And I have videos that explain all of this if you're interested. But just because it's like the most successful, miraculous thing that I discovered in my own drawing and in teaching, it's what I want to show you guys today. So this pencil is too hard. These are my new favorite pencils. Get ready to write this down. These are awesome. These are Faber-Castell's Pitt Pastel pencils. So they're pastels in a pencil. And they're not with the colored pencils. So you'll hunt and hunt and hunt and not find them. They're with the charcoal. So you have to turn around to the other side of the aisle or go around the aisle to the charcoal section. They used to be with the pastels. In Blick, they're now with the charcoal. So every time I send a student to the store to get these, they're like, they don't have them anymore. I'm like, they do have them, they just move them. They don't know where to put them because they're pencils in a pastel. What I like about them is that you can make a very, very light line, which you guys can't even see, and it can get darker and darker and darker, and you can go all the way to this. So it's very, very pressure sensitive. I really, really like the range of value you can get. All right, so we always do a mark for the top, mark for the bottom. I'm working backwards here. I like to have my subject here, but we are conformed to this space just a little teeny tiny bit. First thing is just the envelope. So longest lines first, and I'm going to work a little darker than I would. This is me being loose. Loose does not come naturally to me. I had to train myself to be loose. The way I like to draw is like this, right? Don't we all like to draw like that? But what I have found for my own drawing is that making several lines instead of one helps my eyes find the solution within a nest of lines. Our eyes actually are very, very good at telling when something is out of proportion. We have extremely well-defined instincts for proportion because that is exactly why if you've been working for 20 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour and you step back from your painting or your drawing and you're like, no, it's usually a proportion problem and you can't believe you didn't see it. But you did see it. You're really good at seeing it. You're really good at seeing how wrong it is, how bad it is, right? So what we want to do is we want to harness that intelligence. That intuitive intelligence is very smart and very refined. I teach my students with very little measuring, no sight size, no reliance on external devices. The learning curve is about this steep. Because what I want to help people develop is their intuition. So is a human being shaped like this, or is a human being shaped like this? We know. Usually our drawings are somewhere between those two. But we know a person standing up is going to be a little bit more like this. Every single time we ever draw a person standing up, we draw it too wide. Every time we ever draw a banana or a person or a stick lying down, we draw it too tall. There's a way that we want things to fit into a more comfortable space, and we don't like the width for some reason. We all make it too wide. So when I block in something like this, I actually purposely make it more narrow than I think. I actually think she's more like this. But I know, because I've made this mistake over and over, that I'll purposely make it more narrow. So the two things I say all day long, every day, are make your lights lighter and make your block in narrower. In fact, I don't have to teach it all. If people just read the posters on the wall, I could just leave the room and 90% of the teaching would be done. Make your lights light and don't make your figures too wide. And now I've messed up my board. Oh, I actually have a little tiny piece. Don't we all have this stuck somewhere, a little tiny piece of dirty kneaded eraser from the bottom of the bag? I shouldn't have drawn that there. I'm a little worried about that painting. Move this right over there. So this is step one, that's all it is. So there's no indentations. It's like building a coffin around someone, and whether you're doing an arrangement of fruit, whether you're doing a tree, whether you're doing a landscape, the basic shape is just really, really simple and basic, as simple as you can possibly make it. And then for step two, we just want to start thinking about how we would divide that up. So what I used to do is have people continue with this drawing. What I do now is I have them start again. Redraw their envelope, because what it does is it makes you rethink. I'm not copying my drawing. I'm looking again at the original and trying to make the same decisions over again. Often I find that I've misjudged something. I'm going to tilt that line. First I had it like this. I'm tilting it out just a little bit more. So when we repeat the steps with every single time, we are reinforcing, this one's longer too, we're reinforcing going back to that envelope shape. When in doubt, do an envelope. Because what an envelope does is it stops you from doing the bow and arrow trying to hit the deer or mastodon or whatever. And it stops you from picking fruit off the berries off the bush. Both of those things are very necessary for survival, but both of those things are terrible for art. So art is not necessarily a survival mechanism. It must have dovetailed with one because we still like to do it, but doesn't actually really, sitting here drawing isn't helping me eat tonight. Ever. Right? So what the envelope does is it gets your eye scanning. And making your eye do this works for proportion, it works for value, and it works for color. Because what it does is it stops you from isolating what you're looking at, and it gets you to compare everything all at once. So if you are trying to figure out two values that are right next to each other, something a little lighter and something a little bit darker, if you stare right at them, you're going to make them different. But if you're keeping the entire picture in mind, you're going to realize they're more similar to each other than you think that they are at first if you just stare at them. So the same way that our eyes exaggerate size when we stare at something that we're interested in, our eyes also exaggerate difference when we stare at something. So we want to break the habit of staring. Now we stare all the time. We zoom in our eyes all the time. We do it anytime we pick up something off a table. We do it constantly. The only time we don't do it is when we're looking for our keys. We kind of do this. So I've noticed something. I don't know if any of you ever noticed this. How many people here listen to audiobooks or NPR or whatever while you're painting or drawing? I like to have something narrative going on in my brain because I'm a talky person and it kind of keeps the talky part of my mind entertained. What I have noticed is that sometimes if I've lost something, the other day I lost a tube of paint. Turned out it was in the trash in a paper towel, but so doesn't that always happen? And so it was actually one of the key paints I wanted to show you today, so I was like, I really gotta find this one. What I have found is that I'm drawing or painting and listening to my NPR. If I lose something and I start searching around the room for it, I have to turn off the NPR. Have you noticed that? Or the book on tape. There's something about searching for something that it doesn't work with having a narrative going on at the same time. I think that's amazing. I think the brain is just absolutely amazing. So, I don't know how that relates. It was just a little fun thing. All right, so I'm going to look at ways I can cut into her. And I'm going to do this really dark and messy, super beautiful subject, but I'm going to look for ways I can cut right in all the way across the form to start to get a feel for. I'm looking down at her a little more, so I'm seeing more of that pedestal than you will. Start to get a feel for what she looks like. And normally I would do this for step 2, and then I would probably go into, she's got a tiny head. Have you ever drawn her? Anybody ever drawn her before? She's got the tiniest head ever. She's got like a little pinhead. What I want to do is start getting a feel for the gesture. And what I want you to notice, see how this line relates to this line? The only reason I notice that is because my eyes are scanning like this. What we often do is we go, oh, the waist tucks in right there, and then the hip juts out, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and this happens, completely forgetting what's going on over there. The nice thing about straight line blocking is it makes a network or a web that keeps all the parts related to the whole. And that's what the nature of drawing is. When you see a beautiful drawing, it's really out of whack if the knees are too low. Like, you're like, oh, that's a great drawing, too bad the knees are too low. Like, we just notice these things, they're just wrong. So we have the ability to see them, but the ability to draw them, something about when we draw, our eyes start to focus on that pencil point, and we stop looking at the whole thing. So all sorts of exercises to exercise that shape seeing. So what I do with my students sometimes is, so we have these little birds, and I actually think they're done from Audubon plates. They're actually pretty nice. I just bought them on this is the thing to search for. Ready to paint, have you heard of these? They're little white figurines, and they're stupid. Most of them are like Mickey Mouse and Frosty the Snowman or something. They're just little unglazed white figurines that people can paint. So you can Google ready to paint on eBay or on Etsy or whatever, and you find all these little white unfinished plaster figurines. And if you search through, you can find these little gems. So I have these little birds. Don't they look like Audubon drawings? I mean, I don't know. They're much nicer quality. They're not, I don't know. They're not cartoony. But they'll be like at an angle. So we've got a little bird doing something like this, right? This is my little bird imitation, right? But what we tend to do is we tend to straighten it up, right? We always tend to straighten it up. So to really, really get that angle requires standing back and doing this with your arm. So a lot of times I go, okay, so let's stand back and do this with your arm. So I don't even let my students hold up a pencil and close one eye, because they're not feeling the gesture when they do that. And then they do this, they like carry it over to the misplaced board, and they just trust, oh, that must be right, because I copied it. Well, if you feel it here, you can feel it here, and you're going to get it dead right. So we need to learn to trust our intuition and our feelings as much as we trust the analytical measuring side of our brain. And since we do analyzing and measuring all day long, every day, and we're all pretty good at it, I try and have us in the studio focus on the intuitive feeling pose. So what I'll say, I'll do this with you right now. I'm going to point my whole entire arm straight in one direction, and as fast as you can, you're going to match it without hitting your neighbor. All right? So 1, 2, 3. Yeah, mirror image. That's a perfect mirror image. Whether you did mirror image or not, you're all pointing. You didn't have to. Did you look along one edge of my arm to figure it out and then look at the bottom edge and say, well, the bottom edge is a little different than the top edge. How do I know which one? You didn't do all that analyzing, right? You're just like, oh, she's pointing there. I can point there. All right? And so that is your intuition working, because we're actually pretty good at feeling. We can stand up straight, so we know what plum is. And when someone's talking to us like this, we're a little uncomfortable. We can feel it, right? So we're actually really good at tilts and angles and plum. We're really innately good at it. If you can stand up straight without falling over, you can feel plum. Plum is just straight line. And so we're actually extremely sensitive to the angle of a tilt. We can really, really copy it very, very accurately without measuring. When we rely too much on measuring, what happens is little tiny errors in our measurements make it over onto our drawing and our painting. And because we've never felt it, we look at it and we're like, oh, it must be right because I measured it. And when you do that for 2 hours or 3 hours or 50 hours, that's when you switch into a different mode when you back up. You back up and you look at it and go, oh no, it's really wrong. Well, there's something in you that knows wrong, and that means there's something in you that knows right. And so being able to tap into that over and over and over, and being able to exercise, that's a different neural pathway. So if I put my arm up like this, and you're like, okay, it goes a little up here and a little down there and a little up here and a little down there, you're using a more analytical part of your brain. But if I put my hand up like this and you just match it without thinking about it too much, that's more the intuitive part of your brain. That's a different neural pathway. There's one right answer. You can get to the correct answer with different modes of problem solving. One is analytical, one is intuitive. But we spend so much time on the analytical side of our brain, why not spend a lot of time practicing the intuitive part of our brain? And so it's almost like we have a well-worn path for the analytical part. It feels familiar and safe. I know how to measure with my pencil. I know how, if this width matches this height, then I know that I can get that over my paper. We get really attached to those things. When we're over here going, well, how does it feel? I don't know. Like, it's way scary, right? It's much more kind of like we're on open seas. It feels a little uncomfortable. So the only way to make it comfortable is just to do it over and over and over again and build a new neural pathway. Now, neural pathways, anybody take piano? My husband's been studying piano as an adult for the first time in his life, starting about 5 years ago. What he finds is that after 4 or 5 days of practicing the same scale, suddenly it gets a little bit easier. And maybe you've discovered this with other mechanical things that you've tried. There's something about 4 or 5 days that can build some new neural pathways. Now, if you then don't do it for a week or a month or a year, it's going to degrade, it's going to go away. But you can build these neural pathways. And so what's happening when you're learning something new is that your neurons are reaching out to each other, struggling to connect, and we can feel that pain. You know that pain? Like, oh, I'm really trying to make this drawing look like what I see, and I'm so frustrated. And the teacher's telling me to do something, and I don't understand why I can't, and it just hurts. Like, something in your brain hurts. What we got to do is get a little comfortable. Like in yoga, they say, like, it's sensation, not pain. I'm like, F you. It's pain. It's pain. I tell you, it's pain. What we want to do is get like comfortable with that sensation of, okay, my brain is actually physically changing. There are neural networks in my brain that are struggling to reach each other, and it's going to hurt a little bit. But then when they meet, there's a day where you're like, oh my God, I get it. I see it. And we live for those days. As artists, we live those brief moments of time where we feel like we understand everything for one split second of one day, and then we wait 6 more months. So when you start to feel these connections start to happen, you can start to ask yourself, does this feel like her, instead of do all the measurements line up? And then what can happen is we can run into problems, and we're like, something doesn't feel right, or something doesn't match right, or something's in the wrong place. And then what's the answer? The answer is always go back to the envelope. All the problems are always in the envelope. The success or failure of your drawing happens in the first 2 minutes. So if you're willing to go back and reassess your envelope, that means you're willing to go back and change the entire architecture of everything else, if necessary. And that kind of fluidity, intuition, and ability to make changes and not be so committed to the little detail that you thought was super interesting is the difference between getting better every year as a draftsperson, as a painter, and versus reaching a certain acceptable point where you can show in some galleries and sell some work and feel pretty good about yourself, but stay the same. As artists, none of us want to stay the same. We always are, we're looking at art all the time, and our heart is aching that we can't do something. And instead of taking that as despair, what we want to do is arm ourselves with the tools that we can get closer and closer and closer to what we want to do. And hopefully we'll never reach it, because then we'd have no reason for living. So, thank you.